So welcome everyone to month 5 of the Dobra Tea Club. This is the 5th and final installment of the Dobra Tea Club subscription, and I want to thank you all so much for joining me along on this journey. So this month we're going to be talking about black tea. We're going to talk about black tea production, which is fully oxidized tea. We'll talk about the difference between var sinensis and var assamica, and we'll talk about European trade and the development of English tea. So let's begin. So let's begin by brewing our first tea of the day, the Darjeeling First Flush. And so to brew this tea, I'm going to give you a little bit of a curveball here in this brewing technique and bring in a Pyrex measuring cup as my brewing vessel. And so basically what I'm doing here is I'm doing a larger single infusion. And so for black teas, I like to do just a single larger infusion. And so I'm going to raise my volume of water here to about 12 to 16 ounces. And I'm going to increase my infusion time, and then I'm going to filter it into this vessel. So I'll remove all the water into this larger vessel here and have one single infusion. For black teas, I like to do it this way. It works a little bit better than the multiple infusions that you do with something like an oolong tea or a white tea or a green tea. All right, so I have my 8 grams of the tea here, and so you can also see that I've doubled my weight of dry leaf because, again, we're doing a larger volume of water, so it can handle more tea leaves here. So you're welcome to lower that to 7 or 6 grams if you'd like, but I'm using 8 grams for this. So I'm going to go ahead and pour the leaves into my Pyrex here. And so just take a look at these leaves real quick. So this is the Darjeeling First Flush, and you can notice that the leaves are brighter green. They're a bit lighter than a normal black tea. That's because this is a very early spring tea from the Darjeeling region. All right, and so what I'm going to do is I also, with this greener tea, I want it to be just off boiling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour my boiling water into my vessel here that will eventually hold the infusion. And this dials in my volume of water as well, and so I know that I'm not going to overflow my vessel here. And then I'm going to start my timer, and I'm immediately going to pour this water over the leaves. And so when brewing this way, you can use like a plate or something to cover this to seal in the heat. But I'm not too concerned with that, so I just kind of leave it open like this. That's just kind of a preference thing. And so for this tea, we're going to be brewing it for 2 minutes and 7 seconds. So these Darjeelings are very delicate teas, so we do want to dial it in directly to about 2 minutes and 7 seconds. Just with these Darjeelings, just a few seconds can throw it over the line. So yeah, I got about a minute here left. And so I have my filter here. So again, I'm brewing in here, and this is a really cool way too, especially with this tea because it's such a beautiful tea, to watch as the leaves start to unfurl and start to dance in the teapot here. And so again, this is a Darjeeling First Flush. Darjeeling is a mountainous region in northern India, and it's in the foothills of the Himalayas, and so you're getting cool air coming down from the Himalayas with warm air coming up from the ocean, and it meets in Darjeeling to make this really interesting terroir for black tea production. And so this is actually the English developed this tea growing region in the mountains of Darjeeling. And so Darjeeling has 3 distinct harvests of the year. The first flush, which is this lighter style, the second flush, which is a summer harvest, which tends to be a little bit darker, and then there's usually an autumnal flush, which is even darker. And so this is, again, the first flush, an early spring tea here. All right, so I'm coming up on my 2 minutes and 7 seconds, and so just a couple more seconds. And so I have my tea here. I'm just going to go ahead and pour it through my filter. Drop these leaves back in so to not clog the filter. And so you notice that this pouring is taking a little bit of a time. So if the tea comes out a little bit strong, you can start this pouring a little bit sooner so you don't over steep the bottom leaves here. Okay, and so I have all the water off the leaves, so they've stopped infusing. And if I really wanted to, I could go back with this tea, which is a little bit greener. I could go back and do a second infusion with my leaves in here. But now I have my entirety of the infusion in this pot here, and then I can enjoy. And so these aromas that I'm getting are very floral, kind of fruity. It's very vibrant and fresh. We often kind of call it muscatel. It's kind of grape-like in flavor. But yeah, very, very unique for black tea. It's almost like an oolong tea, but it is a black tea. But again, these first flushes are the very fresh, early spring tea, so they tend to be lighter. And then throughout the year, as you get into the second flush, they become darker and more malty, and then they get stronger through the seasons. But yeah, just an amazing, vibrant flavor to this. And so for this method, I know that you may not be equipped to do this method, but I do recommend, some kind of larger vessel like this, and you're just infusing in that, and then you're straining it into some kind of larger pot, and so basically you just need two vessels that are large enough, one to hold the infusion, and then as it infuses, and then one to hold the infusion after you filter it out. If you don't have these, you can use maybe like a large mug and just filter in the mug. But if all you have is the Gaiwan, you are welcome to just use the Gaiwan and just continue very short infusions with this tea. All right, so this is the Darjeeling First Flush. So let's talk about black tea production. So black tea is fully oxidized tea. If you remember in our discussion of green tea, they're applying a high heat process to the fresh leaves to stop the oxidation. In oolong tea, they're both stimulating and controlling the leaves to produce their desired level of oxidation from very light to very dark. In black tea, they're taking the fresh leaves and they're vigorously rolling the leaves and then allowing the leaves to rest to produce a full oxidation. Chemically, you're converting the catechins into theoflavins and theorubigins, which produces the darker color to the leaves. But this also produces less astringency in the tea, so you can use higher temperature water when brewing the tea to produce a less astringent but stronger cup of tea. And so there's going to be various steps all across the tea producing world that are different in different black tea production, like different ways of finishing the tea, but the basis of black tea production is reaching a full oxidation of the leaf. One main division in black tea is whether it's using var sinensis or var assamica. So the Camellia sinensis tea plant has two main varieties, var sinensis and var assamica. And so assamica is a larger leaf varietal and var sinensis is a smaller leaf varietal. And so assamicas tend to be bolder and drier in flavor, where var sinensis tends to be lighter and sweeter. And so English tea producing regions such as India, Sri Lanka, and Kenya are using var assamica, and most Chinese black teas, which actually are called Chinese red teas, are using var sinensis. One major exception to this is the Indian tea producing region Darjeeling, which is actually using var sinensis in its tea production. And so this is a vast oversimplification of this subject. But one thing that we start to understand when we look deeper into this is that Asamacas come from these more southern regions where Camellia sinensis originated from. And Varsinensis is used in these more northern and cooler climates. And so one way to look at this is that when the tea plant started to emerge from these more southern regions and moved into these cooler climates, the tea leaves started to get smaller. And so one way to look at this is that Varsinensis is more or less a domestication of these larger leaf varietals in the further south. So the history of black tea picks up where we left off in our discussion of oolong tea and the development of loose leaf tea in the Wuyi Mountains of northern Fujian, China in the Ming Dynasty. So with producers further developing loose leaf tea, they began experimenting with oxidation. And this experimentation with oxidation is the early developments of black tea and also oolong tea. So in this time period as well, in the mid to late 15th century, you start to see European explorers trying to round the Cape of Good Hope of southern Africa and enter into the waters of East Asia. And so trade with China had been going on for hundreds of years through various land routes, with the Tea Horse Road coming out of the west and the Silk Road coming out of eastern China into the Middle East. And so with the rise of the Byzantine Empire in the mid-15th century, you start to have these Islamic rulers seizing these land routes and not allowing the European Christian explorers to come across land to trade with China anymore. And so this forces these Christian explorers to go by sea and round the southern tip of Africa to enter into the waters of East Asia to trade and to explore. And so in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama is able to round the Cape of Good Hope and enter into India. And this starts the wave of European explorers into this region. And so after the Portuguese are the first to enter this region. After the Portuguese, we have the Dutch entering into this region. And in 1607, the first shipment of tea reaches Europe by the Dutch East India Company into the port of Amsterdam. And so from this point, the popularity of tea explodes across Europe, and all the various nations become addicted to tea, and it becomes a high demand for explorers to go into Asia and bring tea back to Europe. And so you have the Portuguese, you have the Dutch, and now you have the English entering into this region. And through time, the English East India Company becomes the most prominent force in this region. And so trade with China becomes very, very prosperous for the English, and there's a very large demand for tea in England. And it reaches a point where the English want to then produce their own tea and cut out the monopoly of the Chinese tea trade. And so in 1823, a man by the name of Sir Robert Bruce ventures into the Assam River Valley in northeastern India to explore the idea of producing their own tea in this region. And so Robert Bruce, on his trip, he discovers that the locals are consuming a larger leaf varietal of tea, which we now know as Assamica. And so Robert Bruce dies shortly after his trip there, and his brother Charles takes over this initiative in the Assam River Valley. And then further down the line, we have Robert Fortune being sent into China to steal the tea growing secrets because the English are unsuccessful at producing their own tea. And so Robert Fortune is sent in as a spy and returns back to India with tea seeds. And these are Chinese tea seeds. And so these tea seeds are unable to survive in the warmer climate of India. And so eventually the English decide to switch over to growing Assamica. And these Assamica plants become very prosperous in this region. And very quickly, with the help of many slaves from neighboring regions, the English are able to produce a thriving tea economy in the Assam River Valley of northeastern India. And so by 1889, the English are able to produce enough tea to sustain their own economy, and their exports from India to England surpass exports from China. And so this is the beginnings of the English tea and England becoming a self-sufficient tea economy. And so this then expands into regions like Sri Lanka, with Thomas Lipton developing tea plantations in central Sri Lanka. And you have this expanding into Kenya, which now is the third largest producer of tea in the world. And all throughout the reaches of the English Empire, you have this black tea production. And so with this, the English start to develop a little bit more streamlined production, because they're having to produce this tea and ship it, large amounts of it, across water. So they start to develop things like the CTC method, which is the cut, tear, curl, where they're able to cut and tear and curl the tea leaves in the production to take this much tea and then produce it into little pellets that can be compacted into this. And so this starts to streamline tea away from a more artisan style of production into a volume game to produce just a stronger, a more efficient tea to get back to England. And so this changes the flavor profile of these black teas coming into Europe. One exception to this is the Darjeeling, the first tea that we drank today. Darjeeling is actually using var sinensis, so Chinese varietals, in the mountains of Darjeeling. And still to this day, Darjeeling still remains more of an artisanal region for producing tea, where you see single estates and you see more effort to produce nuance in the flavors rather than a singular flavor that you see in the Assamikas of the Assam River Valley. All right, so let's move on to our second tea of the day, the Kenyan. So the Kenyan is a black tea, an Assamika black tea from Kenya, Africa. And so to brew this tea, I'm going to introduce to you another way to brew black tea, and that's it with a filter. And so it's essentially a tea bag, and so you can take the loose leaf tea and you can just put it in the filter, and you can just infuse that way in your larger vessel. And so we sell these filters at a box of 100 for about, I think, $7. So it's fairly inexpensive. And for black tea, when you're doing a single larger infusion, the filter is an acceptable way to brew this. You could still brew this in the way that we brew the Darjeeling, but I kind of like the filter style as well. So I'm going to go ahead and throw my filter into my larger vessel here. And I'm going to brew this tea for 3 minutes. So I'm going to start my timer. And then I'm going to just pour boiling water over the filter and to the top. And then we'll just wait for 3 minutes. And it's okay to kind of give this a few dunks as you go along. And so Kenya is an outpost of the English Empire, and now its own nation, obviously. But these tea plantations were developed by the English, and to this day now, Kenya is actually the third largest producer of tea in the world, second, with India being second and China being first. And so they are producing these really amazing Assamika style black teas in the style of English tea that you find in Assam, India, or Sri Lanka, but with the terroir of Kenya. So it's a really unique style of tea. And so these teas are going to be more appropriate for putting milk or sweetener in the tea, because it will be very strong, bold, and dry. And so it's okay to drink this without any milk or sweetener, but that is how it's kind of more traditionally consumed. So with this last minute and a half, I want to kind of reintroduce an idea that I like to do when I'm brewing tea and when I'm waiting for my tea to finish. And that is just taking some time to connect with my breath. And so when you sit down to brew tea, it does take some patience to brew the tea. And so I utilize these moments to just take some time to connect with my breath and slow down. So for this last minute, if you want to just join me by just softening, connecting with your breath. And as you're waiting for the tea to infuse, just letting go of any need to hurry or finish this process, and just enjoying this moment. And with each exhale, just letting go a little bit more. Now we're approaching our 3 minutes with the infusion here. And you come back. And with this filter style, you simply just give it a few dunks. If you have some tongs, you can squeeze the bag a little bit, but then you're done. And so that connecting with the breath while you infuse, I like to do that basically any time I brew. Just gives me an opportunity just to slow down, and it heightens my experience when I brew because I become more present in this moment, and I become more present with the tea in front of me. All right, so let's taste. And we'll see very immediately that this tea is a lot darker. And a lot hotter as well. Yeah, it's very bold and dry. The Kenyan kind of has some interesting fruity undertones to it as well. But just a nice, bold, dry black tea. Very, an English style black tea. Just a very straightforward morning cup of tea type of tea. So. And again, with this brewing method, these are a couple different options for how you can brew this tea. This tea I wouldn't necessarily recommend in a gaiwan, but you know what? I mean, you can give it a try if you like. That's just fine. But yeah, the filter, or you can use the Pyrex with a filter. This could even be just straight in your mug, and you infuse that way. But yeah, so this is the Kenyan black tea. All right, so that brings us to the end of this 5-month series. And so thank you all so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to taste and discuss these teas with you virtually through these videos and through email. I really appreciate all the messages people have been sending to me. And so moving forward, if you have any further questions, you can comment them here, or you can email me directly, or you can reach me at the tea house. Whether you have a question 3 months from now or 3 years from now, you can always reach out to me and ask me a question. I'm more than happy to help you in this tea journey. If you need any recommendations for any further teas, I'm more than happy to help you with that as well. But thank you all so much for joining me. It's been a great pleasure.